All right, welcome back to another fantastic episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the city of angels or angels. Well, is it? What do you think it really is? I always am welcome to your comments. Is it the city of demons? Is it the city of the dead? I'm always welcome. What you guys worldwide, guys and gals. I noticed from the demographics we got a lot of listeners in Northern Ireland, really? Of all the places in the UK, Northern Ireland. That's really cool. I did not think that's kind of like saying we're broadcasting to Asia, but we're hitting Beijing. I didn't think that would be possible, but we really do. We actually get some genuine people in the chat. All right, so today is a really fantastic guest because of the vast number of topics he's able to speak about. We're going to be talking about past lives. We're going to be talking about crop circles. And did you know that Dan Aykroyd really has a vodka company that is based on the concept of crystal skulls? And you all know, if you've paid attention to Mr. Aykroyd, he's very been interested in the topic of ETs. He's actually done a really great documentary with David Sarita. So without further ado, let me introduce my guest this evening, the one and only Dr. Chet Snow. Dr. Snow, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. J. Nice to be here.
So let's talk about your background. How did you get into these topics?
Well, of course, I am basically a historian to start out and somewhat of a sociologist. That's where my degrees are in. And what happened was that I probably would have stayed in that work, except that in December of 1982, yes, I know that dates me, and I am over 70 years old, so that can either turn on or turn off your listeners. I don't care. My grandmother, God bless her, she passed away at the age of 92 and decided that for whatever her reasons were, I needed to be woken up. And that's exactly how she said it to me. But she came back after passing on physically in way very similar to what Dr. Raymond Moody has talked about in his work on the psychomanteum work, at a time when I was alone and available and very surprised, but at the same time, how can you be upset when it's your beloved grandmother that has just passed, that you were grieving, suddenly came to tell you that, hey, there's more to this reality than you anticipated or expected, and everyone else in your family is asleep, but you're not, and so therefore you can listen to me. And I did, and that changed my life.
So this is,
So,
I've actually heard this phenomenon multiple times, and I'm glad you brought up Dr. Moody because he's been on the show before, and so is Dr. Taft, the only parapsychologist that I know. Now, I've heard of this phenomenon right when someone passes away, the person that they're most connected to, they will physically appear in their room, generally at the foot of their bed as they're passing on into the other life. Have you uncovered that with many people?
I have found it with some other people. It wasn't quite like that, but very close. Actually, my grandmother and I were close, but we hadn't seen each other in a few months before her passing. And part of what happened, it was at the foot of the bed, and it was in a place just like Raymond Moody has described, where there was a mirror. Actually, I was in visiting officers' quarters at an Air Force base in Southern California, very close to you out in San Bernardino at the time, and totally not expecting to get a visit from my grandmother. But that's how it happened, and it is true that it was applicable because I was going to visit her former apartment where she had lived, and she had passed, not that day, maybe 10 days before, and I was going to visit my aunt, her daughter, who was her closest relative, and she lived very close to her at the end of her life, as many very elderly people do. They often have a loved one that, she had her own apartment. She was very independent. But anyway, I was going to visit there and talk with my aunt about what to do with some of the possessions, and my grandmother wanted to tell me that she had some things for me. That's what it was about. She actually said to me, in the closet, which your aunt won't know about, there is a book, actually a box of books, and she won't care, but you should take them. And that was my introduction to what might be called my grandmother being a closet spiritualist. She was a Baptist, by the way, in her normal life.
Wow.
And
Let me ask you this, because you said she chose to talk to you because you were awake and your other family was asleep, right?
exactly. That's exactly what she did. She actually showed me that. She showed me a beautiful jewel box, which was a jewel box that I knew she had had, and there were different tiers. Sometimes you can open a box and the two or three layers come out where you can put your bracelets and your necklaces and things like that. And in that, instead of jewelry, were photographs of my aunt and uncle, photographs of my brother, photographs of other family members, and they were all asleep. And that's what she showed me. And then she said, "You," boom, there was a picture of me. It was up at the top, and I was looking at myself. And she said, "You're awake, so therefore I can talk to you. You're the one who's to take these books." They were books on spiritual healing. They were books on Edgar Casey. They were books on Ruth Montgomery. Many of the authors of that time. Remember, we're in the early '80s. There weren't too many things out there at that time, but there were some. And she said, "Just tell your aunt that you want that box of books, and she'll be happy to give it to you." And that's exactly what happened, by the way. The next day, I went to L.A., where my grandmother had lived and died in Van Nuys, and
Very close to me,
my aunt
actually.
was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she lived in Van Nuys in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years of her life, and my aunt and my uncle was in the, what do they call that? The Skunk Works. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah. Lockheed Skunk Works, right?
yeah. He was involved in all of that, and he was an aerospace engineer, and so my aunt and uncle lived nearby, and it was like, all right, that's what we're supposed to do, and there it was. And so, yes, everyone else seemed to be asleep, is what she told me, and she didn't say that in any judgmental way, just as sort of like a matter of fact, you were awake, and then things started to happen to me, very strange things. One day I was driving my car, which was a brand new car, and I am not a wealthy man, and was certainly not at that point in my life. I worked for the Air Force, and I had a brand new car, which was my pride and joy, and it would stop. It suddenly stopped, and this time I was near Berkeley, and it stopped in front of a bookstore, and I couldn't get it to start. And I thought, what the heck is going on? So I said, okay, I'll let it sit. You know how a car can sometimes you over pump the gas, and so it has to kind of sit for a few minutes, and then maybe it will start. So I walked into a bookstore, and as I am walking down the shelf, the book fell out onto my hand, and it was There Is a River, about the autobiography of Edgar Casey, the faith healer, who went into trance and healed many, many people, and worked with paranormal events from the early 20th century up till his death in 1945. Coincidentally, I was born in 1945, which is kind of interesting. But the point was, this was my grandmother, and she was doing this. And she actually came to me a couple of times later than that to tell me, hey, expect these events to happen until you get settled, and then I am going on because I have other things to do. So that is what I have found with many people. When someone passes, they have a period of time, if they are awake, if they are psychologically available, usually no more than a month or so, where they can interact with certain of their loved ones to help them with the path, to maybe put them in a certain direction, or to tell them that they are holding on to things that they shouldn't hold on to. Perhaps they're blaming someone in their family for something that they think happened, but maybe it didn't happen that way. And from a wider perspective of being outside of the physical body, that person can tell them, nope, look at it this way. Many different reasons. I've never seen it as a negative thing. I've always seen it as positive. And in the many regressions that I have done with people, which is what this ultimately turned me into doing, leaving history behind and going into psychoanalysis, and particularly past life regression, it's how I met Dr. Helen Wambach, who was my mentor, my teacher, my analyst. My grandmother came to me and she said, "You're going to meet a woman named Helen, and she's from Berkeley." Now, I lived in the Napa Valley at the time, so Berkeley wasn't that far away.
Wine country, right?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah, I love. I guess I've always had a love affair with France and French wine. My wife is French, but this was later. I married her later. Anyway, long story. So my grandmother basically said, "You're going to meet Helen and learn from her." And so the next day, I was in not a bookstore, but a little meeting of some people that were talking on spiritual topics, and a lady came in on telling all about her regressions with Dr. Helen Wambach of Berkeley and how it was changing her life. And I said, "Oh, Helen, Berkeley, all right." And so I called her and became her patient first, or her one of her subjects, you might say. She was working on one of her books. And then she said, Chet, you have a research bump. You like research, and I need somebody to help me with my research. So are you willing? And I said, yeah, sure, okay, I'm willing to do that. And it led to, within about 2 years of my quitting my job and my going back to school and getting enough degrees so that I could work in psychology, and working with her, first of all, and then another wonderful woman named Dr. Winifred Lucas, who was from Brentwood, down in Uruguay, and who was a diplomate of the American Psychological Society. And then I worked for her for a while, again, in regression work, helping people through hypnosis to explore aspects of themselves into the past that went beyond their physical birth, and gave them information as to what things were happening in their life today, what their relationships were happening, and of course eventually that led into the future research. So that's where all that started.
You know what? This is actually showing more evidence of non-linear time. So when someone passes, they're able to view not just their past life, not just your life, but where your path is going to go if you make certain choices. Almost like you could see the whole tree.
That's exactly right. Think of it like perspective. If you are walking, you see the perspective of a person who's walking. If you are flying, you see the perspective of an eagle or someone who's flying. And so the perspective from the air is obviously greater than that of the person walking on the earth themselves. And when we're in our body, we're seeing what the body sees. When we get out of our body, and this doesn't happen with everyone, it happens probably more often than we think, but many people don't particularly want to come back to help people or to do something. They have their own agenda, and they simply move on. A few people get stuck, and then we have ghosts. That's what ghosts are like. They're people who get stuck. Part of their energy, at least, gets stuck into some, like a matrix loop, you might say, a film loop. But in the case of someone who does want to move on, but nonetheless wants to intervene and help, they see a perspective that's larger than the person here in their body. And the wonderful thing is that, yes, it is outside of linear time, and you can actually access this state through self-hypnosis and through hypnosis working with someone in a regression or progression type setting. That's what I learned back in the early 1980s and until I became a full-fledged therapist in the mid-80s and worked with many excellent other therapists. Brian Weiss comes to mind, Dr. Lucas, like I say, Dr. Wambach, who passed away in '85, Hazel Denning, many others, mainly from California, by the way, although Brian Weiss was from Florida, or is from Florida. I think he's still around. And then Dr. Moody and the whole near-death experience. All of this comes from gaining a wider perspective about what reality is. It's not just nuts and bolts, yes or no, that we see here on the Earth plane. It's the eagle view that you need to take.
The whole view, right? That's what you're talking about. The whole perspective. Everything.
I'm not sure you ever see the whole perspective. That, I suspect, is beyond our capability, even as souls. We're still in bubbles. We're bubbles in bubbles and bubbles and bubbles. If I understand how reality works.
You mean of time? If each of our lives is a bubble?
Yes, and beyond time. Time is part of the bubble. There's a multiverse that goes way beyond time and space, I believe. And this is what my experiences have led me to believe, and the experiences of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people that I have worked with. I once said I've heard 5,000 stories. I have no idea of exact number, but it's somewhere around there.
You got 38 years, so 37 years, right? From 82 to now. That would probably be accurate, I would think.
I think so. I actually physically worked in therapy work as a full-time profession from '85 to 2015. So what's that? 30 some years, right?
Yes, yeah. See, we actually overlap in that time because you started what you're doing before I was, or after I was born. So we got that at least pocket. We were both on this plane in that bubble.
So can I ask what year you were born in?
Yeah, 79.
Okay, all right, yes. So you were a youngster and growing up, and I think it's very important that these concepts became popular in the 70s. That is to say, they became known. Edgar Casey, of course, lived long before that, but his availability to people was very limited, and ultimately, because he was unique. Although it's interesting, he once said that there were other people who could do what he did, but he was very unique, and so the ability of him to influence other people was very limited. Whereas in the 70s, due to Dr. Moody, due to Dr. Wambach, due to books, like I say, that were coming out like Ruth Montgomery, all of a sudden the concept of reality being greater than this physical yes and no, three-dimensional type of thing, going beyond time, like you said, that became it hit a worldwide scene, and so people growing up, just as the whole television age and the cell phone age have hit us since then, and the internet age, that was a time when people began to see that reality would go beyond the physical, everyday things that you can see and touch. And I think it's been a very important aspect of our modern culture because it's allowed us to go into other areas of reality. It's allowed people to accept that the things might be, what is it? Nothing is exactly as it seems to be.
Yes, yes. Speaking of what you're talking about, what happened in the 70s, to me, actually, I go, of course, that was a huge leap. And even the 60s, just studying the history of the 20th century, the fashion, what they were talking about. And as you mentioned, the internet, that revolutionized everything. Distance was no longer a problem. And you could also even look like internet. We created its own animal. It sort of let it loose. The animal that connects us to communicating with each other. As you mentioned, there was that time. If you wanted information, you went to the library. You got that book out. You studied it, and you really didn't know if that topic was even in that county.
That's true, absolutely. Or if there was anyone else who was interested.
That's right. I had a very difficult time finding people who were interested in ETs, in ghosts, in past life regressions. As you mentioned, it was kind of hard. I went to Santa Barbara, very open school. Those topics were touched, but in law school, when I was in Loyola Law School, you couldn't talk about those topics. It's like they were very taboo still.
Well, yes, I would think particularly a school like Loyola, which was of a religious affiliation. It's interesting because, of course, the Catholic Church, even though publicly it holds a stance of being very anti-spiritualist, if you go beyond the public level, they're very into the whole aspect of ETs and going beyond the human race, and that there is a wider reality. Because, of course, obviously the Christian faith is based on miracles and on things that are unseen that can't be proven scientifically. The resurrection, for example. All of that is, but publicly, and what they would be teaching students would be very compressed and limited, and that was the old way.
Now, let me ask you this is even if you look in our history, in our Bible, you find examples of death, of angels, which I don't know at what point in the 80s I started to not look at angels as with wings. I thought the reason why painters painted angels on beings was to illustrate that they just simply had the ability to use technology to fly.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's like in the earliest days of ufology, ships were seen as like sailing ships in the sky,
That's right, the airship
and of,
mystery of the 800s, even the
and of
1800s.
course we never see sailing ships in the sky, but that is what people could relate to as something moving, as something that was beyond them, and a transportation device was a ship. especially one with sails, blah blah blah. And so yes, that's what you see. Nowadays, we have very different points of view, and we see them very differently. In the first years that the Europeans came to the American continent, which was, of course, in the 1492, but in the 1600s, if they encountered new coastal civilizations of Native Americans, sometimes the natives would not even be able to see the ship because they could not recognize that something on the water that looked like that could be something a human being could be associated with.
Yes, something artificial, right? You mentioned that,
Yes.
and as I was studying history, it was so hard for me to grasp how, because they had never seen anything like that in their entire lives, and then all of a sudden you have these. I was in Hawaii not too long ago, and what
Hmm.
I was told about the local king, the unifier, the great King Kamehameha, what
Yes.
he was is before he was even born, a symbol was prophesied that this king is going to be born. Captain James Cook, by accident. Now, we really don't know if it's by accident if you're looking at this nonlinear time, right? This needed to happen in history.
Hmm.
He landed in Hawaii, and the symbol was on the mast. Great. King Kamehameha was cemented as the king. Hawaii was unified. He turned his back to walk to the ship. They killed him. He was no longer a god. And I always got a little kick out of it. There's nothing pleasant about something being murdered. Yet the irony of he was this god because he was prophesized for a symbol, yet he was just a human.
Right. And of course, when he showed his humanity and didn't act the way that the people thought he should as a god, I think he was rather. What's the right word? He wanted to punish them for some reason, right? And so he had somebody killed, I believe, and that so the answer was to kill him.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
exactly right. That's right. And that's
that
how it happened because somebody on Captain, he was either Captain James Cook who ordered the killing or he did it himself. Regardless, when he turns back to walk to the ship, it was revenge. They were gonna get him. And this is what I was told from some locals I know, the Cousins brothers out there. They actually got off his arm and used it as an instrument to say he's immortal, and now I'm holding it. I don't know if it was like a what they attached to it. I don't remember that. Oh no, this is what it is. I believe they cut off his leg and used it as a peg.
It may well be because what they did in doing that was to show the rest of the people around there and anyone who would come and see it afterward that in fact this was not a supernatural being and he was flesh and blood just like them. And that was of course what they wanted to show. You know, the history of Hawaii is very interesting because it wasn't too much after that, maybe 40 years, 50 years after that, that a whole nother series of visions were given to a spiritual chief in the Hawaiian Islands about Christianity, and it's how Hawaii became Christian and welcomed the missionaries. I don't know if it was again a quid pro quo or something going on, but this guy was given a very prominent vision of the cross, and that people would come with that cross, and that they should listen to them, and that their old taboo system, which was rather nasty actually, if you think about it, you could simply cast a shadow on somebody and it would kill them if they were the wrong class, or the wrong caste in society, and women couldn't eat with men, for example, and even King Kamehameha, his first wife, his most prominent wife, was of such a higher birth that he had to approach her on his belly, on walking backward,
Yeah, yeah.
on
And,
his feet walking backward.
I actually found this out too. Surfing was reserved for kings only. The wives couldn't surf, the children couldn't surf.
That's correct. Only actually, I think it was warriors, not just kings. It was warriors, the chiefs, or the chief's family. And yes, it was just the men. And then, as this new vision came and the missionaries arrived, they had their problems. Don't misunderstand me. And fortunately, the society had evolved so that when they showed their human side, people didn't think they were gods. So they weren't routinely killed. But it changed the whole society and essentially allowed Western civilization to have an impact. For good or for ill. I make no judgments on those kind of things. History is history, and that's how it is. But whatever happened was supposed to happen because that is what happened. That's how I see that aspect of things. But coming back to all of this, the whole point of all of this change that's been taking place since about the time of Kamehameha, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, is to say that we live in a reality that should not be bounded by these three-dimensional and even the linear time aspects. That we are beings that go beyond that, and we can go beyond that. And it's important for us to get that understanding in our reality that we do live in this multiverse, and this multiverse has perhaps an unending or endless number of possible permutations, possible changes. So we choose as we work our way through this, and each choice is going to engender a set of consequences, a set of actions. That's what the Eastern religions call karma. It's nothing wrong. It's each action has a consequence, and the consequence will lead to another action, and the action will lead to another consequence, and all of those choices essentially make up the reality that we live in. And then we die, and hopefully we get a higher, wider perspective, unless we're trapped. And the trap is an emotional trap, by the way. I'm sure if you work with ghost stories or know anything about ghosts, you know that they always have an emotional component to what happened to them.
That's what links them, right? That's what links them to
Exactly.
that time period, to that castle, to that prison, whatever it be. They're
Yes.
living in that circle, sort of like they're not can't break through that time field, almost
Yes.
that barrier.
Yes. Yes. That's what links them. That's what keeps them there. And it may not be, one thing I have learned is it may not be that the whole soul is kept there. It may only be an aspect of the personality that lived that life, that had that trauma, that had that terrible sadness or that terrible longing or whatever that is kept there. Which is actually, I think, a good thing. We shouldn't think that there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of souls that are trapped somehow. The soul is going on, but that aspect is like a tape loop. Like I said, it's sort of like on a tape loop that's going to be played over and over and over and over again. It's why many times when people do ghost hunting or they look and work with ghosts, the ghost they're only in that time. They don't understand this time. They don't understand previous time. I've never heard of a ghost talking about its childhood.
Let me ask you something that I always ask anybody who researches ghosts, because there's just two questions that it's not limited to someone who's studying UFOs, and yet it crosses over to that topic, and I
Mm-hmm.
find it that surprisingly, even though I was not getting different answers, once I opened that door and people like Barry Taff, Dr. Moody, Grant Wilson actually gave me an answer, I was like, wow, that's a whole different perspective. So here they go. First question: have you ever read about a ghost of an alien?
Actually, no, I never have.
Let,
I have never read a story of an alien ghost that is haunting a particular place, but that is identified as not being human.
that's exactly the irony. Is as we have all these crash and retrievals, and you have instances where you would think a non-human being would be, but they're not trapped in this time.
And I believe that it has to do with the emotional body, because it's the emotional body that gets trapped.
Now, let me ask you about the etymology, because Jordan Maxwell really, every time I would say history, he's like, well, that's actually his story. That's Jesus. I'm like, he had a little bit of a negative connotation, and he would break down every word. Sunrise, things like that.
Well, the problem with that is that it's linked to English.
Yeah,
And English
yeah.
is not the universal language. It's our language that we happen to have in our culture in our time, and right now on the planet a dominant language due to computers and due to aeronautics, because all pilots all over the world have to speak English. There had to be some language
For
that they all had to speak.
aviation,
Otherwise, how
right?
could they land? How could they land in a foreign place if they didn't speak? The language to get in there. But and the internet and has led to that also. It is the common language. But those things that we take and make etymology out of into English, I'm not sure that would be at all, because when the Bible was even written down, it was written down in Hebrew, it was written down in Greek, it was written down in Latin. It wasn't written in English at all.
That's actually 100% correct. You're right. And if you flash forward where we are on in America to 1,000
Right.
years ago, we were not speaking any of these languages that we now have in the Western Hemisphere.
Oh, of course not. No, no. All of the basic language. I mean, there are some Native Americans who still do speak or understand languages that go back over 1,000 years. The Hopi here in Arizona, for example, the elders and those that are learning, and the language is coming back alive again for some people of their tribe. They do speak a language that's that old. But and believe me. If you translate the Bible into Hopi, and it is no doubt translated, I'm sure it's translated everywhere, you don't get the same etymological language references like history, because it would be something completely different in their language. It's always been one of my pet peeves with some authors that they tend to put a lot of baggage onto ancient texts which were not written in English because of how they've been translated into English.
I'll even give you a perfect example that most people wouldn't agree with me unless you people looked it up. Everyone has this evil connotation of 666. If you read the Bible, I'm talking about not what you're picking up from,
Mm-hmm.
King James. If you read what the Greek, and this it doesn't even survive past the seventh edition, 180 A.D. The Greek edition of what John wrote in the book of Revelations. The mark of the beast is listed as 616, X1X.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I admit I had never heard that, but why not? I mean, um, he was simply writing something that he saw, and X1X might not even have been letters; it might have been numerals
That's
in
right.
his day. It,
It
you
it was
know, and
completely lost in translation.
exactly. Yeah,
Now,
no, I think that's one of our. It's one of our. Now that does not take away from the fact that ancient texts still have modern day meaning. Many of the things that are described in not only the Bible but the Rig Vedas of Hinduism or the books, of the Buddha and the Quran, et cetera. They tell us universal truths. That's why they have lasted so long.
and they do, yet 3,000 years ago, you really didn't. You could throw out the Old or the New Testament, but okay, let's go back to even before the Old Testament, say 10,000 years ago. None of that
Hmm.
really applied to us.
Well, there wasn't, according to modern science, there was nothing written down 10,000 years ago. Writing started under the Sumerians and cuneiform. Now, it may be that they have found some symbols in what is today's Turkey at a place that's about 10,000 years old, but mostly writing actually started and sacred texts were actually formed in Egypt about 3,000 years ago and in Sumeria about 5,000 years ago. Um, so that's where, and of course, if you read Zechariah Sitchin, you understand that those texts that were written by the Sumerians, they say they were dictated by beings who came from somewhere else, not necessarily gods, although they saw them as gods. They were extraterrestrials.
Let's talk about ETs for a moment because I have really been like, I don't know at what point in life I realized that not only were we not alone, but it was like during Sunday school. I was being told about Jesus. And don't worry, I was raised, not to say don't worry, I was raised a Christian, but that was kind of shattered very early on. I was like, wait a minute, what if Gabriel was an ET? And I'm talking about like this when I'm 3. I mean, the Sunday school teachers were like really pissed at me, and I was kind of getting in big trouble because I was breaking every law. I was saying, well, what if the Northern Star, and I don't know what was feeding this information. I was always talking with Georgios Tsoukalos, and he would say, man couldn't pick anything up in a vacuum. But really, there was nothing I was getting from osmosis. There was nobody in my classes, even to this day, that would acknowledge what I was talking about then, because you didn't have internet then. The God to me was Stan Friedman. I was looking at who's going to give me a clue into what's not what we're talking about.
Well, when you were a child, you nevertheless had the internet, that is to say, from your own past lives. So it's very possible that there's always bleed through of one way or another. Zechariah Sitchin was the same thing. He was raised as a very devout Jew, and yet in Israel, because when he was born in Russia, but he lived in Israel in the 20s and 30s as a settler, and they were very religious. And yet, when he would read the Old Testament and read certain things, he would say to the teacher, "But it doesn't really say that in ancient Hebrew," because he would learn ancient Hebrew, and the teacher would look at him and get very mad because he wasn't spouting the party line. So what you're saying is that you too had something coming through to you from your own internet that was taking precedent over what you were being told. And that's the sign of someone who's going to go and learn something and teach something new.
And this is what's the irony of it is when I look to my grandparents, they really grew up very different, like separate from society. In Greece, their lineage can be traced back to like never having left Greece since literally Neolithic Greece, and grew up with no water, no running electricity. My mother, the first toy she had was a giant rock outside, which is maybe 3, 4 foot diameter. It took about 10 years for my grandmother to gather enough fabric to make her a doll. And yet, I'm here in America, I'm born here, and all these radical ideas that no one can really connect to me on when I was so young.
Well, like I say, remember, you do not come in as a blank slate. This is a great fallacy of modern scientific material point of view, secularist, if you want to call it. We are not blank slates when we're born, thank goodness, in a way, because if you look at the world and from a strictly one life point of view, there's no justice. Why is somebody born rich and somebody born poor? Why is somebody able to live, a nice life into their 70s, and why is somebody else going to die at 20, or even at 10, or even as a child? Why are some people massacred and other people the killers? All of this means, to me at least, that we do not come in as a blank slate. We have a history. We have a past. We are who we are, conditioned by many, many, many other times that we've practiced here. It would be not only unfair, but even kind of ludicrous to imagine that all of this material world is set up for us to have one go at it.
Yeah, you know what? And when you really think about how short our lifespan is, there's not so much. There's only so much we can gain. I believe what you're saying is that everything that has come through me is an echo, a memory from a past relative. Some people have even explained it as it being in my DNA.
And it probably is in part in your DNA. I have worked in my retirement with genealogy, and genealogy essentially talks about DNA, although it goes much wider than that. It's also all the cultural and family influences that one can have. But yes, DNA is part of it, but it's only one part of it. You see, I believe there is a soul DNA. Your DNA that we think of as physical DNA, but there's a soul DNA, and your soul DNA is all the experiences that your soul, which is a non-physical consciousness, right? The
Hmm.
consciousness, which actually they say has even been measured at something like 0.005 grams. Somebody did a study of people when they died. They weighed people just as they were about to die and then right after they died. There was a very slight difference, but there is a difference. So something is going on, and the soul DNA, as I call it, is also influencing you. And your soul DNA and your physical DNA may have nothing to do with each other. So even though you are from a very strong, many generations of Greek background, which obviously influences how you think and see and look at the world, it may well be that your soul DNA was bouncing around the planet. And one time was in Africa, and one time was in Asia, and one time was in Northern Europe, and one time maybe was in Atlantis. Who knows? That's the beauty of understanding that we are more than just the physical DNA that we're born into, or even the environment we're born into.
Being living in Los Angeles, such an active city, even at my young age. My grandmother died when I was in law school, so that would have been when I was in my 2L. So I was 24. So by then I'd already have friends died, accidents, shootings. It was a very violent area, Los Angeles, right? Yet you still have the people who die that passing away from natural causes. The person that that connected with me the most, because I was there when she died, was my grandmother. I was holding her hand when she passed in the hospital. That really affected me, not because I saw it, because when I came back to my apartment, it kind of stayed on me, almost like she bled on me, but she really didn't, like her soul.
Well, as I said, with my grandmother, I wasn't physically there, but she was. She said, "You're awake, so I can reach you," and she did for a limited period of time. And there came a time after about a month, maybe 6 weeks, she had been visiting me on a regular basis, that she said, "Okay, I'm turning you over to Helen." And I mentioned Dr. Wambach that I had started to work with. She said, "I'm turning you over," and essentially she said, "I have other things to do." And so when you went with your grandmother, yes, no doubt her soul, her spirit, connected with you, perhaps not in a conscious way, but in an unconscious way for a short period of time. Now, if she had not left, you would be what we call attached. And this is a problem many people have in our world today, especially if they have had, like in wars, comrades, or even in hospital experiences, close people close to them emotionally who have died and didn't know what to do. They could attach themselves to you. It's not possession. Possession is something that's a whole other topic. I really don't like to talk a lot about possession because it's fairly rare, and it can be very violent. But in this case, it's usually someone that you knew, had emotional attachment to. They attach to you, and it will limit you. That's the problem with it. Because your perspective is no longer really your own. You are taking on someone else's. Now, your grandmother, from what you're telling me, came. She shared with you that experience of leaving her physical body, which is an extraordinary experience to share,
Hmm.
and then she left.
When I got to my apartment for a good 6 months to a year, I've literally felt her soul presence in my apartment, at her funeral, when I visited my
Hmm.
parents. It's like she was in the car with me. She was in the room with me, and then just one day she's gone.
Right. Well, and it may be that if this wasn't about a teaching, learning on a conscious level, she realized that in fact she was not able to give you more, that your experiences in that time were being influenced, being colored by what she was able to pass on to you, and that she'd reached the limit of that, and she had something else to do. Don't
Yeah,
think that when you're
in the
dead, you're
past
done.
life, that's right. That's the whole idea that I was always thought. How could we literally live such a short life? We have to be echoing all those people who made us, all the generations that just go back. I would think that each of their fingerprint, soul fingerprint, digital fingerprint, if you want to use internet terms, is kind of like the way I would look at it, as it is attached to me.
Well, I think that we are, and like I say, the only problem is that if someone whom you are emotionally attached to has passed, and they stay with you, they then it influences both your future and their future, and it's not in a good way. It really there's a time for everything. There's a time for that learning. There's a time to be influenced, but then you have to go on and be you, and they have to go on to whatever they're supposed to do. It may be that they have to come back. Many people come back. We come back very fast these days because there's so many bodies available. There's so many vehicles, as Helen Wambach used to call them,
So many
available
different
today.
consciouses, right? So many different, yeah. That
Yes,
and when you really think about the numerics, we have seven. Is it 7.8 billion? What the current number is of the population?
I think it's over 8 now, actually.
I remember watching the movie Armageddon with Bruce Willis. 6 billion people. You NASA could only do this. It's like 6 billion
Right,
20 years ago. 8 billion 20
right,
years later.
right.
25% increase. 33% increase when you're looking at it from the 6 billion perspective. That's a
Yes.
massive increase.
Well, it is, and I've heard people say, well, how can the how are there new souls being created, or is it something that what are you doing? Uh, I don't know. I'm not sure we have an answer to that. But one of the ways to look at it is Edgar Cayce, when he was asked a question about human souls here on the planet, he indicated that in his uh, opinion or in the way he was given the information from the other side, uh, there is a finite number of the souls that have become human uh, from a non-physical origin who came into the physical world of the earth, got attached emotionally to the physical world, and in a sense stayed here. Now, what then could happen? And the only logical explanation is that two things. One is that in the past we probably did not incarnate very fast, so there maybe was a vast reservoir of souls who were not physically present that now can be. And the other would be that very possibly, and I have had experiences with this with some of my clients, so I do believe that there is a possibility to this, that you can experience as a soul more than one physical body at a time.
I would
That is
really
to say,
think that would be the process, right? I would really look and think that each birth is another vehicle, as you mentioned, as Helen mentioned in your life, right?
right, very much. And so therefore, one could fathom or imagine or get the idea that you are learning as a soul, not just from your experience as is your name John, I think, right? As
Yes.
Jay,
Mm-hmm.
as John, but also perhaps as Ed over there, perhaps as Pablo over there, perhaps as Esmeralda over there. You know, all of that is going to influence and help your soul to evolve.
All right, let me. You've. I'm assuming because this is why I love when someone is talking about more than one topic. Because if we're only going to talk about ghosts, then if we're not going to talk about UFOs, it's like they cross over. They have to have a crossover. Now let me switch over to extraterrestrials. I always ask Preston this because he really goes into depth when he studies this. I'm always looking for an answer. If abductions could happen at any time, place, or moment, I'm looking for an abduction story that happened inside a prison. How many people were taken when they were surrounded by 5,000 other people?
Well, I don't know. I have never had. I have had abductee clients. Um, I have found that in all the cases that I could think of, and it's not something I sought out, but yes, people did come to me sometimes that they probably had some connection in their past lives with the abductors, with the alien beings. They may have been human and they may have been abducted before. There's a actual genetic, it looks like, DNA background to many of these people. Somehow there are bloodlines that are being followed. I have never heard of one who told me that they were abducted in a prison, but the truth is I haven't had very many prisoners as clients either. So
That's
the,
true. You don't have very
the
many that were
population
authors either, right?
that I've dealt with, isn't that population. Now, somebody who maybe goes into prisons and works with prisoners might find such a thing. I don't know.
I
But
just
I
would think
personally have not.
I would think that it has to happen statistically, right? It would just have to happen. Sure, there's really bad people in prison. Then you have those people who are they get caught up in the system and then come out. I would think somebody at some point in time, whether it was in our lifetime, 500 years ago, there had to have been someone at some point who was held captive, and yet they were being visited.
I, I, I I think that's logical to assume that that has been or is the case. Remember, when we're talking about abductions, again, this is not my specialty. You should get Barbara Lamb.
Yeah,
She's the
yes.
person who really is the specialist on this. I love Barbara. She's a wonderful, caring, deeply conscious human being, and
Very
her
warm. Yeah,
experiences are
she's very nice.
very well. She's a person who heals people, and that's why I love her, because she has that ability within her to help them to understand what's going on and thereby accept and acknowledge, and that's the key to healing. It's acceptance and acknowledgement of who you are and what you're doing, and then it's all right. That it's all right. Maybe even some of the bad things are all right because they are part of what you needed to go through and you had to go through. It doesn't mean that the bad is good. I would never say that, but it may be that that's part of a process. Anyway, coming back to abductions, I think some of the abduction process may feel physical to the person, may be experienced as physical to the person, but in fact, physical, the body of the person maybe never budged, maybe never moved.
No.
Remember, the
Mhm.
aliens can deal with time and physicality space in ways that we cannot.
Oh yeah, I really love to look at that perspective. This is crazy. I not that what I'm about to say. I've been stuck on trying to figure out the concept of how anybody can look at the flat Earth, right? And I've come on this guy's channel, Simon Dan, and he's a scientist and constantly debunking videos. One video, it's crazy how I ended up there. They're talking about the perspective you could see a flat Earth, but it's a curvature, but yet when you're looking at it from gravity, it looks flat. And it's like, hold on, you're throwing gravity into the mix, which is the way I would attach to it, but I just can't see how anyone could make the idea of a flat body or we cut a cube or a dish or some. How does it that in this time, you had this maybe happen thousands of years ago, but just now in the 2019, there's like 40 million searches for flat Earth a day? Are you kidding me?
I don't know. Everybody has a different perspective on these things. I do think some people feel that if they return to something that is simpler and more easy to understand, and a flat Earth may be that way of thinking, that it's going to be better for them.
That would also imply very linear thought to me. Very linear.
Well, and some people limit themselves. A multiverse can be scary to some people. Maybe they need the idea that everything has an immediate cause and effect in the physical world, and that you can't have a reality that goes beyond what you can experience physically. I certainly had people in my life that that was their concept, and it was comforting to them. And so while it's not mine, it may be what they had to live through and be in order to function. As a psychologist, a person who works in psychotherapy, I'm all about helping people to make sense of the reality they're living in, function in that reality, do the very best that they can with it. And there's going to be limits to that, and it's going to be different from person to person.
Let me ask you this. This is actually very personal to me, what I'm about to say. When I was growing up, right, because of where I lived and the simplicity of my my grandparents, great grandparents, even my parents, they were coming from small villages of Greece. I believe in my father's village there was 30 families when I visited, just 30 homes. That's it, Metohi. My mother's family was even smaller in Tripoli and Volis, very, very small. When I'm living in America, growing up, at 10 years of age, I was very like, I felt out of this world, out of this uh, plane, because by 20, I'd already experienced severe death. I experienced from close members of family. Even my own, like, I almost died. I had a coma when I was 34. I was in a 40 plus day coma. Even in that time and suffering, I even acknowledged somebody who had been dead for over 30 years, who 30 years ago I didn't even really pay attention to him. And yet there he is creeping back 35 years, 25 years later into my life, in that coma, in that instant.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
The other thing I wanted to ask about is in that short time frame, pain, suffering, love, lost, you have an emotion you want to throw, rich, poor. It seems that I experienced it in a matter of 25 years, and then I became more settled. I don't understand what was going on in the psyche, but it's like I needed to see more than what people were seeing that I was in. My classes. When we went to, of course, I'd been to Europe when I was young, but it was completely different when I went with Pepperdine. Because on top of going to law school, I also got a degree from Pepperdine School of Law, in mediation. So I also went to Switzerland. I went to Paris. That not only broadened my scope, it kind of settled me. I don't know what that was about, but it seemed that I was far more curious than anyone around me. I was always busy with my mind looking for something when people could stay still. I don't know if it's because of the sign of the times that there's so much more out there. I guess it could be because this generation, it could have been the simplicity of my parents, great grandparents in the past. This time frame of the internet popping up in my late teens and before it didn't knit the whole world together. The concept of Greece and Europe and Asia seemed so far attenuated for America, yet they were connected.
Yes. Well, what I'm hearing from you is that your background, your family DNA, and your parents and your grandparents gave you an anchor, gave you a point of solidity, something that was solid, that was firm, that was, in a sense, unchanging. And that allowed you, as an individual, and obviously part of your soul is projecting through you as an individual, to explore a whole wider range of topics and experiences than perhaps someone who didn't have that anchor, that solidity, whose background was fluid, whose background was changing, who didn't have the love of their parents. And believe me, people are born into that kind of world too, right around us. I'm sure you know people like that. They therefore had to seek the solid aspect of their life in something, in a relationship or in a belief, or in a church, or in a teacher, whatever it would be, something that would then become their anchor. You understand me? Because
very much so, yes.
If you don't have something to anchor onto while you're in this physical body experience, it's sort of like psychedelics. You could float off and never come back. At least that's our fear. That's our emotional aspect to it.
Let me ask you about memories, as you were talking about how I've heard this concept. I don't know where I picked this up from, that each time we go to sleep, each one of our dreams is actually us exploring into the multiverse. What do you think about that concept?
Well, I think it is. I think it's part of our reality, and that we only bring back like 10% of our dreams or something like that. They've done studies of where they see when people are dreaming because, like you notice a dog, their hands are moving, their feet are moving, things are happening, their eyes flicker in their REM state, right? Mm-hmm. That's also the state in which you can go into hypnosis, or you can go access into past or future lives. So all of that is part of your connection. You're opening portals. Let's put it that way. That's the best way to put it. As you open those portals, you only bring back maybe 10% or even less. And the reason probably for that is that our current mental state, if you couldn't handle a lot more. I think we could only handle so much.
Very, very much true. And as each year progressed, as each memory expanded, as each act was fulfilled, each act of love, each act of sadness, each act of kindness, I expanded fully. It's like I developed fully into that form. And you're right, if I did not have the anchor of stability, which I see a lack of in friends, and even my own goddaughter, right? My best friend, he broke up with his girlfriend, and he has a daughter, and he's got full custody, and it's like his own upbringing. He didn't have the stability. I was very fortunate to be able to have that. And this also, I think, influenced me too, is the fact that I didn't learn English till I was 5. I remember my very first memories of kindergarten at 4. I didn't speak a word of English. And that was a very, very broadening experience. As I learned English, I had already known Greek. It's like it was filling in the blank. It's like a different experience, if that makes any sense to you.
Yes, it does. I understand. I think anybody who has the ability or background to have been bilingual in that respect, that at some point, especially as a young child, you were influenced by another language and therefore another culture than the one that you're currently living in, that's a plus. I think there's part of even your brain that expands because the areas in your brain that work in Greek are not 100% the same as those that work in English. I was born into a family also where my mother was a language teacher and spoke French as not just a native language. She was born in America, but her family spoke French as well. She came from a French background. And so she taught my brother and me when we were, before school, kindergarten or earlier, French as well as English. So we grew up speaking both. Later I revolted and learned Spanish just to spite probably get away from it.
I'm
But
actually
never
learning
mind.
Spanish right now, just to fill in that trilingual mind too.
Well, there you are. But my point is that by having that experience, you automatically have a wider world than someone who is strictly into one language, one culture, one set of realities. Uh, Now, we've all, in my opinion, again, through past lives, through our experiences in dreams, even, and some people, there are people who have dreamed in other languages that they don't understand. Sometimes they're a made up language, sometimes they're a historic language, sometimes they can bring back words. Um, that expands your brain, it expands your consciousness. So your consciousness is able to go further, is what I'm trying to say. I think one of the greatest disservices our modern society has done is that we have not created close-knit nuclear families for young children. After 6 or 7, yes, a child can have a lot of different experiences, but it's that first 3 or 4 years of life that is really important. And having, parents loving each other, loving the child, paying attention to the child learning through the parents, through the experience of where they are. Even the fact that in our past, people lived in villages, like you said, in Greece, with only 35 families.
That's right.
This
It
was
was
this
so
was true in
shocking,
America too.
right?
This was
Yeah.
true in America too at one point,
When I
and it's
looked at
very different today.
America and you've seen the movie, the recent Orson, not recent, but 20 years ago, Time Machine, the remake of it, right? Have you seen that new movie? The recent one,
What's the name?
Time Machine, Orson Welles.
Oh, well, I saw the original one. I've never seen the recent one. I haven't seen the remake.
The remake, there's a scene where he's using the time machine and he's traveling through the 20th century and he's looking at a department store window. And you see as each decade passes, like the hats and the dresses are like the hats women and women are wearing are very big and their dresses
Yes.
are very long. And each decade that goes, the hat shrink and the dress shrinks. And as you're seeing each year, right, of the time machine roll by, it's like it's so it blows me away how within 100 years we've seen so much. This generation, the last 3 generations, 5 generations, if you want to even give that point.
Yes, well, change has accelerated. I mean, there's no doubt about that. What my grandmother, who was born in 1890 and who died in 1982, experienced was incredible. And even if I
World
look at
War
it from
II,
what I
right?
have experienced, born into I call us the atomic generation. I was born in 1945, along with Art Bell and Whitley Strieber,
Mm-hmm.
and others. So that whole atomic experience has changed the world. If you were born after the atom was smashed, it's not the same as being born before it was smashed. And then going further from that, well, there's the psychedelic experiment that took place in the 60s and then the 70s. And now we have the internet, and particularly the, what do you want to call it? I suppose you'd say the device generation, or the electronic generation, has changed again. It's too early to tell what those influences will be, but I think they're very structurally important as to how people will experience life later on, hopefully as they also mature and grow older. But each of those kind of things, it's still when the child is at its youngest and most formative that if there is a basis of love, stability, and it feels confident, that will change its life for the better as it grows.
Do you know Steve Jobs, before he passed away, said doing LSD was one of the 2 or 3 experiences, that's a quote, that meant that what had to happen for him to get to where he was. I didn't quite understand it, but it needed to happen in his life for Apple to be born. And he was not a very nice man, especially to his own daughter. He actually denied her paternity. Lisa Brennan Jobs said that if she wrote a book about her father in the 20s, it would have been full of hatred.
I understand. And why did he deny that? There's something going on as to his own background, his own childhood, that would lead him to deny that he could procreate, and he did create a child.
That was his own his own biology, right? He himself was If he was denied that, if his parents gave him up for adoption, I'm sure that would have some influence. I would
Well, that's
think.
what I'm saying. I don't know. I don't know Steve Jobs' biography. So if that is true that he was given up for adoption, and then well, it makes perfect sense. Why would that he could not acknowledge that he could have a biological child? Uh, and of course, there's always the whole money aspect of things. But that's not what happened. I don't believe. I believe it was this very deep set lack of ability or confidence to see himself in the concept of parent, because he didn't have real parents. He had adoptive parents, which is wonderful. I'm glad he had adoptive parents, but it's not the same.
Very, very much different. What I've seen friends that have gone through that experience, their psyche is like, it's like they almost feel like they were rejected. And it's like, well, this family selected you, but because they're not the products of those two parents, they're missing something. I really see that in some people. They have an anchor that's missing in the lifetime.
Yes, and that actually is one of the areas where past life therapy can be very helpful to a person, to help them understand why their soul chose that way to come into this life. What is it that they were coming to learn, and what were both the birth parents and the adoptive parents teaching them? Because both sides are teaching them something. And when you can get to that point, you can get, not everybody reaches there, but you can get an aha moment where you say, oh, okay, it is something that ultimately I chose to learn from.
That is a very, very big in my family. If I didn't have that, first of all, both that stability and also that symbolism of being able to look at the two people that carried that everywhere, whether it be the happiness, whether it be what I actually realized too, if they didn't have the if they didn't grow up with the poor of literally having nothing and appreciating everything. The first job my father got when he came to America was a dishwasher, right? We looked down as that something shameful. But what did he have a stroke as? As a genius rocket man, rocket scientist. It's like it really happened. His dream. All my parents, all of them came to America with nothing, and yet they all flourished at the same time. That's not an accident. That they came here, they actually had everything to appreciate. They appreciated the boats that brought them here. They appreciated the ships that flying them. They appreciated LAX. They had to eke their way through existence to make something. And once they got it, they were so happy because my mother was telling me about what she grew up in, she said that grandpa would have to go occasionally the chicken, no, they would get eggs, but once in a blue moon they'd eat chicken. It was like such a rarity for them. It's like, wow, how much food do we throw away that I throw away every day, right? It's like I'm given such an opportunity. I kind of feel bad, but at the same time, I wasn't wealthy at any point.
Yeah, well, this is always the case when someone has changed continents or changed lifestyles or changed everything like that. Uh, Hopefully, they do come to an appreciative place. I think it's very important for people that grow up because again they made conscious choices, and the conscious choices are going to influence them even more than the unconscious ones. When people are born into something, it's very different for them. They don't understand or see what they came from or where they came from in the same way. It is one of the reasons I enjoy genealogy, because it does help people to understand that, hey, okay, maybe you were born into mid 20th century America and into a nice middle class urban lifestyle, but go back 3 or 4 generations and see it's very very likely that your great grandparents or great great grandparents lived very similar to your parents. You see,
They
had
did.
a
They really
and
did.
maybe they were even pioneers here in America. This was a continent that had few people and lots of animals and lots of land, and that people could spread out in, and people could get lost in too. Some people chose to get out and get lost because they didn't like where they came from. Uh, you know, so all of those things influence us. But I think it's coming to a realization that you are not a victim. We are not victims. This is for me what is the most important part of past life and future life therapy. We are not victims, we are choosers. And sometimes we have to take choices that will seem to be difficult because it is what our higher self, the part of us that is really more wise and knows what's best for us, says we have to go through. And
You
that can be
just
difficult.
you just literally explained my entire life being with that sentence. I am not kidding. You just literally explained what I was trying to lay out earlier of what my life was. Like, I purposely chose the difficult angle so I could see more than what my peers did. If that makes any
There
sense
you
to you.
go. And that's why you have the show you do. That's why you interview the people you do, because you're still seeking. The most interesting people on the planet are those who want to learn and seek and go beyond what is the accepted reality around them, whatever that reality might be. So, in some way or another, now there are sometimes catastrophic results from this. Some people, the expression "you bite off more than you can chew,"
Mm-hmm.
and I have dealt with some of that in people, and sometimes you get kicked and land on your butt. Well, the point being that you don't lie down and say, "Oh, poor me." You say, "Okay, I kicked, got landed on my butt. Now, what am I going to do about it?"
That's absolutely right. The more I played. I'm always made it a point not to play the victim, and those that played the victim and stayed the victim, almost like you mentioned with ghosts, stayed in that time. They never moved past that
Exactly.
incident.
Exactly, because they let their emotional body take over, and we have to be a mixture of the emotional, the analytical, the physical, the spiritual, the genealogical, the the DNA, the soul DNA. All of these things are make us who we are, and it is in our lifetime, yours and mine, we have had the unique experience, and this has not really taken place for a long time, of seeing reality shift from geocentric to one little community, one little village, one little family, one little this I, to a much wider, bigger. Now it's even digital, extraterrestrial, multiversal aspect of reality to us, and so that is the kind of the zeitgeist, as they say, the historical aspect of this particular generation. In India, they call it the confluence age. We are confluent, and confluence indicates three or four rivers coming together, streams that form a much bigger, broader river, and eventually a bay, and then the ocean. And the ocean, of course, is cosmic consciousness. And in a sense, we exist already in consciousness, cosmic consciousness, but we are also at the same time heading there in our mind. Our mind is developing toward that, and yet it's already there. That's one of the difficult aspects of multiverse for people to grasp. But it is true. It is not just linear. There is more than the linear. You can be in something and not know it, and so you're coming to know it. And in our time, through all of the advances in science and technology and beyond technology, and our coming together. In fact, there were 7 billion of us, so we have to really share this planet more than other people did in the past. All of that is forcing us, in a sense, kicking and screaming, into some understanding that we now have physical signs even in our world that there's more going on. And I'm going to segue that into the crop circles, because that's why I got interested in crop circles.
Mm-hmm.
I got interested in crop circles because they were and are a physical manifestation that cannot be totally explained, despite what some people want to say, by a totally physical reality. Something is happening that goes beyond our understanding of just physical boards stomping down grain in a field.
Even what I've noticed with crop circles is each crop circle they have like a different technology fingerprint of how they were created. Like if you have bring instruments into a crop circle, am I explaining that correctly? Like if when you're outside of a crop circle, like your atomic instruments, no, that's not right. I'm trying to think of what would be picked up on the outside of a crop circle that yet you could feel on the inside.
Well, The clearest examples that I know of are with photographic instruments, because obviously crop circles are what we might call mandalas or artwork. They have an aspect to them that is visual, right? Without being visual, we would not be attracted to them. And most of them are attractive. They attract attention quite deliberately, and just like a flower attracts attention, right? And uses color. Well, a crop circle doesn't use color; it uses vibration, and it uses geometry. And geometry has certain sacred geometry formulas of ratios and mathematical precisions are attractive to the human brain. They call us in. If you have an inquiring mind, they say, "Wow, that looks unusual. That looks different. That's fascinating. I want to know more about that." That was my first experience. So for photographic equipment, which is very sensitive, and digital things are a change as you approach crop circles, and particularly when you're in crop circles. Another thing that people found in working with crop circles is that we want to get an aerial perspective, so you see them from that eagle point of view, like I mentioned earlier. Well, when you fly over a crop circle, particularly with helicopters, there's an influence on the engines.
Yeah, I was very
actually stop.
They do. They really do.
2 seconds.
Yeah.
And then, fortunately, they get them started again. I don't know of anyone that's ever crashed, but nonetheless, all the photographers I know that, like Steve Alexander or Francine Blake, that have been in England or other places that have photographed them from the air, say that you get this vortex feeling, that something, and the engine of the helicopter often, shudders and the cameras. I have been in crop circles myself where the camera, if it didn't malfunction, if you have a battery-operated camera, the battery drains in a matter of minutes. Something that's a full battery that should last weeks drains.
It really also does, and I love how you talked about the eagle perspective. Not very many people know this because it was just recently uncovered, but when I was in Hawaii, the cousin showed me what was actually able just to be filled in an area that's not even filled. I mean, who would think you have Hawaii that has like areas that are not filled, right? But it's like almost like a compass, and you could only see it they only caught it from a drone. Discovery doesn't know about it, history doesn't know about it, but it's there. Yeah.
Yes. And actually, one thing that's happening with drones is drones are now taking more photos of crop circles because they're a rather simple mechanical device, and so they're not as affected by the energy change. So they can fly pretty much over them and hover longer. Most of the helicopter photos, they have to stay to one side of the circle, and they have a slight angle. In fact, Steve Alexander, who's the British photographer that my wife and I have worked with, he produces a yearbook of crop circles every year of photographs. They're extraordinary, and he and the helicopter guy, they take one of the doors off the helicopter so he can lean out into the circle while the helicopter stays slightly to one side. And he still has his cameras drain out.
That's more actually proof that something is going on there. I'm sure you've noticed how some cameras, like nowadays, they're not really taking pictures of a two-dimensional flat plane. There's a lot more in that area that they're projecting onto that, a piece of digital footprint. Whatever you're looking at, it actually has substance now.
Right. It has more than before. We have three-dimensional perspective from our eyes. And so therefore now we're able to more project that into the not just film process but the digital process. That's an advance in technology. But the point that I'm trying to make with the circles is that yes, some are human made, there's no doubt about that. But in general, the ones that react and the ones that have the energy that react come from a source that we're still not sure about. And that's what attracted me to the phenomenon, because here is a physical sign of something that is beyond our three-dimensional linear time aspected world. They appear, they're there,
and gone,
and they influence us.
Yeah.
And then they're gone. And they influence us, and then they're gone. And even when they're gone, this is something I learned in England. The farmer harvests the field. The part of the circle, the energy remains.
It doesn't
And
change with
even the
technology, with the
following
weather,
year,
right?
well, even the following year, this is the strangest thing. Even the following year, when the farmer has plowed the field, the crop that comes up in the next year, where the strongest parts of the circle were, reacts differently, grows differently, usually better than before. And part of the design will come back.
Have you seen those pictures of that Linda Moulton Howe took? It. She calls them dragonfly drones. She says that as they fly over a crop circle that are activated, it's kind of like a glitch in the matrix, and that's why we're able to photograph them only because they're cropping through something that activates them.
Yes, and they call them balls of light as well. And in fact, they are operating at a vibratory rate that goes beyond much of our ability to see, but is still within the aspect of light. Light goes beyond. There's infrared light we can't see, and there's ultraviolet light that we can't see. So our human perspective only sees certain things, and these are acting on the borderline. Let's call it that. So that they're oscillating in and out of our ability to perceive them, which is why you see them and then you don't see them and then you see them, and sometimes UFOs do that too.
They very, very much do. And now, because we have cameras virtually everywhere, you can't really go down LA anymore without being captured on film. Like, you're always seeing, you could look back like 20, if you go 20 years later, you could look back at this time period and it's all photographed, it's all videotaped, right? That really wasn't the case 100 years ago.
Well, obviously not even 50 years ago.
That's right.
I don't think. And in England, it's similar to here. Now, they don't photograph fields necessarily very often, but any place that is a crossroads and any place that there are houses and hamlets and villages, yes. And sometimes crop circles appear. And we know that the ones that are a genuine phenomenon that have these energy changes that I'm talking about, they usually appear within seconds. All of the quote eyewitness or ear witness or whatever you want to call them, the closest to witnesses that we have of them, say that if there is a ball of spinning light or a mist or something, it congeals, it does something within 5 seconds, boom, circles start to appear. And it's as if it sets a grid that is electrically, I believe, transmitted to the soil and to the plants, and the plants then move.
In a crop circle, the stalks, right, that where they're, hold on, let me try to get this properly.
It's called the blown nodes.
Where they're
elbows.
Yes, yes.
They're like little elbow joints. They're like a joint in the a wheat crop. Let's just talk about wheat. It's the simplest one, and about 2/3, 3/4 crop circles are in wheat, although they've come in every grade that there is, as far as I know. Even oats, even rice. Have had even grass, even sorghum, which is a kind of a grass they make molasses out of. We had a sorghum set of circles here in Arizona. Could you believe it? You don't think of Arizona and crop circles,
no,
but yet we've had
you
crop
really
circles
don't.
in Arizona.
But I would think there kind of has to be now. Hold on, let me phrase that correctly. I would think that the chances of likely happening. Remember in the 80s, at least when I was growing up, they always blamed it on Doug and Dave. That was so not the case. It wasn't those two guys from England that was making things in India, in America, in Alaska, in Arizona. And it just blew my mind how two guys took credit for other beings, and yet they covered the whole globe.
Yeah, well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but we know that the mainstream media does not tell the whole story of things. And they were brought out, no doubt paid by governmental or other forces that didn't want people exploring this phenomenon further, just like UFO phenomenon. They were brought out to tell a story that could be plausible. Even if it isn't plausible, it was plausibly deniable, so therefore the media immediately, boom, caught on to that, and they became the authors of all of these circles. Later on, both of them actually admitted, I think they're both gone now, but they actually admitted that they did not create all those circles, that there were certainly ones going on when they weren't around. They certainly weren't in other countries. They'd never traveled or did any of those things. And that at one point, one of them actually said, oh, yeah, the designs of the ones we made, we were kind of given that in our minds.
That's absolutely right, and that goes to the argument that I was having with Giorgio Tsoukalos. He said nothing can be created in a vacuum. I don't think that's the case. There are things that are created in a vacuum.
I don't know what a vacuum is.
Right? I can't even perceive that a vacuum. I don't even know what that is, to tell you the truth. Like, to me, there was never any absence of anything in my psyche, in my mind. There's always something there. There's always something going on in fields and wheat and corn and grass. There's always something there. That's the way I've always perceived it.
Well, we have actually historical stories of crop circles going way back into the 18th century, back to the 16th, 17th century. The very first newspapers that came out that in the 1700s, 18th century, they talk occasional things of crop circles. They weren't common, and they were given usually a religious kind of witches or something, devil creation story, because that was what would sell. Newspapers wanted to sell back then just like they do today. They always take the most negative aspect of any phenomenon and try to project it, because people buy things out of fear more than they do out of joy, alas. But that is part of the human psyche. But so they've been around for an awfully long time. I do think that we have been again in a kind of a age of development that allowed them to come quickly and much more readily than before. And probably, this is my take on it, we are leaving that age behind now as we go more and more digital and as we go more and more electronic. I'm sure you're aware that the phenomenon worldwide peaked around 2001, 2002, and actually has declined significantly since that time.
It's almost as that's the time of being when they made public that we were actually having exoplanets. Do you remember that
Yes.
discovery? We were,
Yes.
even in my generation, I was taught, nope, it's all empty gases and pulsars. No, that's not the case. It's like the current number is 1.8 planets per star. That's a huge number, massively
When
huge.
when you think of the billions of stars that we know of, and the untold numbers of galaxies that we don't know of because our instruments are not able to go far enough to catch a phenomenon of them, a glimpse of them, if you will. The light refracts so much that we can't tell what it is. Yes, I totally agree. And the other thing that happened right at that time of 2001, 2002 was that suddenly America went on terror alert.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and after that time, we have concentrated much more on the I'll call it the cycle of war than we have on a renewal cycle that was coming up in the 90s to take us forward. And the millennium, let's see, we were focused on the millennium, but suddenly the millennium was over.
It's gone.
And
Yeah.
what had to fill it? What had to fill the gap? Well, the gap was filled, alas, with 9/11 and with all of that stuff.
That was
And
really our defining moment. It's like project. What was
and it may have been.
the
I'm going to
2000
suggest
bug?
that might have been deliberate. That's what I'm going to suggest. That's as close as I'll come to being conspiracy. I think it was
I
deliberate.
totally believe it is because I'm a very conservative. So when I watch One American News, you see ABC News, everything is a bad. Impeach this. It's like, shut up. Really, you're spinning the story and making it so fake, and yet you're seeing the truth when you change one channel.
Yeah, and you know that the major crop circles that appeared in August of 2001 were the binary messages that came. One was the face from Mars, and
Sedona.
the other
Yeah.
was a binary message, Sidonia, and the other was a binary message about that was sent into space by I think in the
The
70s or 80s, and then this was
astrologist, not
yes,
the astronomer,
and
right?
yes, astronomy, and this was a message that came back next to a big array of astronomy
The
equipment in
plate
England.
it wasn't that Arecibo, the Arecibo message, where we sent out the
Yes,
binary of the humans, we're the third
yes,
planet, and then we got it
yes,
back, and it's like they got a different
yes,
array. We're sending out
exactly.
voice technology, sound, but they're using something else to capture it.
And it came back in a crop circle, and that crop circle came 2 weeks before 9/11, and it was obliterated off of any other radar of anybody talking about it after that.
Wow, I never even considered that. It's like I've in my being from 79 to 2001, I spent most of the time there, and yet from 2001 to 2019, I have less than my life here. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I do. I understand. It was a watershed, and it was a quite deliberately created watershed. And the same is true in the crop circle phenomenon. It's also true with the therapies like past and future life therapies. You hear a lot less about them today than you did 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Most of the therapists that were trained in this work were trained in the 80s and 90s, and there are still people coming along. That's not 100% anyway, but it's a lot more rare now than it was back in those days. And the same is true with the circles. Now, for example, we still had this year. I do a little research on this, and I did before talking to you. We still had 42 known circles, but 42 compared to over 200 in 2000 and 200 in 2001.
1/5.
So
Wow.
that's right, 1/5. Down to 1/5, and of that, only 20 or 24 actually came in the UK, whereas in those earlier times it was 3/4, 2/3 were in the UK.
What
So it's really changed.
I always thought was that they had more of a canvas. Was that the case? The UK?
No, not really. I think, frankly, that they came more in the UK because this was always my theory anyway, that the UK was the leader in genetic engineering of animals.
They were also
We
the
think of it,
center of the universe a couple hundred years ago, or even 50 years ago, right? They were
oh,
really
even
the
100 years ago.
revolutionaries. Yeah.
Yeah, 100 years ago they were. But here's what I believe the crop circles came to do. They came in a specific time to show us something greater in reality than is being done by the genetic scientists, engineers who are trying to map the genomes to the point that we can take over and create life as if we were God. And that started in the UK. Dolly the sheep is from the UK.
The chimera, right? That was the first genetically, or not, the first born lamb in a test tube. Is that
Yes.
what it is? Yeah. Wow.
No. She was genetically modified.
She did have a mother, but we made her.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
And
that was in the UK. And that happened just as the crop circles started to take off.
Let me ask you about soul, right? I've always wondered, because see, when we ourselves are born, we talked about this earlier, as we're vessels, right? How does that work when it's artificially created?
Well, I mean, there's still a zygote. Just one second. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I dropped the phone for a second.
Don't worry.
I'm not sure that an artificially genetically engineered body attracts a soul.
That would make sense because you're not having the echo, right? You're not having the echo of the previous generations carried into you either.
Yes. Well, it would. It wouldn't. I'm not sure. I don't know if we're able yet to create an actual life out of nothing. I don't think we can yet.
Yeah, I don't think we've really reached there, right? We really haven't come to that being where we could say, here's a human that has no influence from any of our human creators. We don't really have that yet, right?
No, but we're trying.
Yeah. I always when Dan Aykroyd gave that with David Sarita and that videotape about 20 years ago. You remember? It was really just Dan Aykroyd just filmed, and he was just talking about different theories. And at the very end, he says, "I would. The only question I really have is, will we make it? What is 300 years from the future now?" Well, that was 20 years ago. So much has happened in those 20 years. It's kind of like, well, now you got to change that perspective too.
Yes, probably. I think. Oh, I don't know. I'm not going to say. We've only been 75 years since the atomic generation took place, and that is one of the big problems. And now the genetic generation has been about 35 years or 30 years. So will we make it? Yes, I believe we will, because I think we've done this before. We have obliterated civilizations before, Atlantis being the one that we keep in our memory, but there have been others. And
Rome, the Greek Empire, they all fall, but they all rise, right? I mean, they may not be the same. Yeah.
The experiment continues, and I do believe will continue. However, the kind of human being that we are may not be the one that will survive. I don't know. That's the jury is still out on that one.
Documentaries after the nuclear age, it's like we're gonna have nuclear future, or not a refrigerator, but like a toaster. It's like that was really going on in the 50s. That you really looked at the future as the nuclear age.
That's what people believe, but now they realize that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah,
it's much too dangerous. Frankly, I'm not. If we do not survive, it may well be because of not the bombs, but all of the nuclear waste that no one knows how to deal with.
They can't get rid of it. That's right. And also, this is what. Tell me if this is correct or not. Stanton Friedman used to talk about the coming of the nuclear age was like the signal that was telling the aliens, the kids have found the matches. We got to go there now and pay attention to what they're about to do.
Yes, well, that's when intervention or whatever you want to call it, intrusion became commonplace. I think that we have always been watched, and if Sitchin and his work are correct and the Sumerians are correct, we have been essentially shepherded as a civilization, as a race, by extraterrestrials from the beginning. Whether it was for their own selfish purposes or for higher purposes is hard to know. Some channels talk about this. I'm sure you know that I work with Barbara Marciniak, who channels Pleiadians.
That's right.
Pleiadians have been part of our culture from many, many different perspectives for thousands of years. The Native Americans talk about it. There are cultures in Europe that say they came from the Pleiades. The Seven Sisters of Greek mythology, all of them go back to that star system or series of star systems. So we have a history there. But will we succeed? And it again, I think that the biggest problem is that when you deal with nuclear, you're talking about thousands and thousands of half-life years, whereas our civilization is only a few thousand years old, and any political system that we have is only a few hundred years old, maybe 1,000 at the very oldest. If you go back into the Middle Ages, some of the countries in Europe and Asia that have existed for 1,500 years, 1,800 years, but none of them have had the same political system, and they've all been overrun by other people. What happens when these places are overrun where the nuclear dumps are, and the barbarians who do that don't know what it is, and they just, throw it open? What happens when somebody takes over Fukushima that isn't going to keep the water cooling down the reactor?
That really scares me, that the fact that the nuclear waste has finally reached our shore. What are we going to do about it? It really is not in the news anymore.
No, I know, and that's why I say human beings have a tendency to forget and live in very short spurts, whereas the nuclear stuff, that's one reason you won't have nuclear toasters. People who run things came to realize that they couldn't deal with the massive amount of waste that it would create. So we only use it for really very big level generation of electricity and power and things like that. And only in places where other natural ways of getting the sources of energy are either very, very expensive or not politically possible. But we're still using it because of those reasons. But I have always wondered what will happen when civilization will break down. It won't end. It will break down. There will be changes because there's always changes, and you get a new political groups in who perhaps don't have the same scientific background or knowledge or even understanding. What will they do with those sites?
That's a very scary concept when they're talking about nuclear waste in tens of thousands of years. It's not
Yeah,
our
yeah.
generation's problem. Let them deal with it. Let's just throw it as far as we can, and they'll deal with it in the future. It's like, remember, I don't know if you've seen the last Steve Jobs movies, which probably was most accurate to really nail him as a son of a gun. He talks about that when he got fired. I'm sure this is just created. There's a lot of things in the movie that they're not accurate. It's that movie whole is a fiction, but there's a point he talks about when he was fired from Apple. He goes and starts his own computer, and he comes up with this diabolical plan. He says, "Well, what if I don't create an operating system for my computer, force Apple to create one, and then they have to buy me back for 1 billion shares?" And it's like this very diabolical plan. And then he brings up Skylab. We set up Skylab for a data gathering mission, and
Right.
we didn't know how to get it back, but we thought in the 8 years it was going to go up, we'd figure out how to technologically bring it back. We didn't. A little to the left, a little to the right, it would have killed somebody. It hit the Atlantic Ocean. That's the way he looked at Apple. He really wanted to build a computer the for education system. The technology didn't quite catch up. When it did, it was like, screw you, Apple, you're gonna buy Steve's job back. And it was like a very diabolical plan, but it worked.
Well, and he is just one example of human nature, and he was a brilliant, brilliant man. And what concerns me is when you reach people who are not brilliant, but who are just barbaric, who
Very,
just
yes.
see cold power and don't understand what was going on from before. That to me is concerning. And if the experiment of humans as we know them ends, it will be due to something like that, much more than it will be to atomic explosions, in my opinion.
I
That's
really
always
think that's
been my opinion.
probably the case. That just it makes more sense in what more we know now. That 2019, that would be the view I would personally adopt. Let me go to some questions, so I don't feel bad because obviously these are some good ones here. This is Lasha Senyek. Why does he think that crop circles have gotten more and more complex as time has gotten by?
Okay. I think they've gotten more complex because once they got our attention, they are a learning experience. And just as you don't take a 6-year-old and put them into a college course at the same time, you don't give a 6-year-old mathematical abilities to someone who already has 2 PhDs. That's part of the complexity aspect to them. They have always been, in part, teaching us that we can be more than the physical reality around us, and they also have a curative aspect to the planet itself. One of the reasons they've been all around the planet is that they are creating limited in time but vortex points that go into the Earth as well as going into the sky. And then even if they're limited in time, that energy is somehow anchored and goes down into the core. And I do believe that has been done quite deliberately to help stabilize some of the aspects that we have been destabilizing with our genetic and our atomic experiments.
This is my own little throw to the mix. This is what I learned, which really threw me for a loop. I was watching Joe Rogan on something, Bob Lazar, there we go. And they
Mm-hmm.
talk about how just recently the primates have entered the Stone Age. And there they show an Australopithecus spearfishing. But the inference is not that they figured it out on their own. They're doing it in the wild, but they're only doing it because they've seen from afar what humans are doing. So when you really go back, it's like this has to happen, and then like we're gonna go on, and then they're gonna dominate the rest of our. And another great video I've come upon, I just randomly stumbled it on YouTube. 7 reasons why we are not from this earth. One of the reasons is looking at the earth, and we're like taking over it. We're like roaches, right? We are not supposed to be in this ecosystem. What do you think about that concept?
Well, I think that it's half true. We are of the earth and not of the earth. We are a hybrid. That's I've always felt that that's true. And our bodies obviously partake of earth materials. We know that there is a connection between us and the primates. Uh, there's DNA that's very similar to us and chimpanzees, for example, but there's enough difference that something changed, and it didn't change through natural selection. There's no history that quote missing link is still missing. And that means that something intervened. Did someone intervene or something intervene? Was it a conscious selection that was made, as what the Sumerians and Zecharia Sitchin say to us, and now Barbara Marciniak and her channeling are saying to us, or was it something that was more random and more or less like the 2001 movie, where there was a so something came from space and it, impacted the primates without knowing it. A certain few of them suddenly changed in their brains. The jury is out to me on that. I don't know. But we are still of the earth. That's one reason we stay here on the earth. Our bodies are of the earth, and yet our souls are not. Edgar Cayce was very clear in that. He said our souls were attracted to the physicality of the earth plane, and we are here to learn a series of lessons, especially emotional ones, to learn to handle these very difficult human emotions. And some succeed, some do not succeed. Some partially succeed. None of us are, or very, very few of us are A students. I'm certainly not an A student. Just ask my wife.
I can't really look at it from that perspective because school was so easy. The further I got along, I was like, how can they not get it? Math is so easy. The further I got, high school, college was easier, university was easier. The only thing that got more difficult was law school. But even after that, the next law school was freaking easy. I just don't know why people around me couldn't get it. And I'm not to say from perspective from being an asshole. That wasn't the case at all. I just couldn't know where they were coming from. The same thing where I couldn't understand why someone would grab a gun and shoot someone. They didn't understand the ramifications. I just could not understand how people did not think something through. How can you have an action without a consequence? I never ever understood that. Like chess, right? You don't think of one move ahead. You think of 10. I think I really approached life that way. In some ways, I still do. If I didn't have the upraising I did, I wouldn't be looking at this conversation the way I do. You could see my own fingerprints on this discussion I've had with you.
Of course. Obviously, you're the interviewer. Who's going to direct what's going on but you? That's very clear. But at the same time, you have a perspective that comes from your past, and so that's why I can't say that we are totally alien to this planet. I don't believe that. I think we are a hybrid that is taking aspects and elements of this planet and from somewhere else. And hopefully making something unique. I do believe humanity is rather unique, especially our emotional body and and that is our biggest challenge and also our biggest success. I've heard from many channels that if you succeed in getting through the Earth school, it's like, wow, you're kind of a respected soul.
Yeah, you need that fulfillment. And one of the things that I think I've come to realize is that upon your death, you have to go through each of those emotions because you're going to be flooded with everything at the same time when it's not so linear anymore. That's the idea that I've been kind of getting.
Yes. Well, linearity is very important in requirement because think of it this way. If a child could never learn to run if it didn't stub its toe and go beyond stubbing its toe and learn to walk and live with the pain and then realize the pain will go away and figure out that the next time it takes that step, it won't stub its toe again. It will avoid the rock. And then it learns to, I can walk. Okay, so since I can walk, I can actually go faster and I can run. If the child would stay at the level of the pain of stubbing its toe, it would never learn to walk and never learn to run. And that requires linearity.
I took it one step further. I'm a skydiver.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah.
Skydive then.
I need to see things from that really broad perspective. If I don't see it from up there,
vision.
I can't. Yeah.
Get the eagle vision. That's important. Of course, but not everybody is competent and or able to take the eagle vision, and not in this lifetime.
Let me look at what else here I have for you, because I know we've gone past the times, and I know I blew past the break because this is so awesome. I'm so glad I got you. I know we're going to have to continue this, but let me look here. There was something else that Lasha wanted to ask. And let me thank Justin T for the super chat too. Lasha and the Blue Crew. Lasha says, does he think the beings doing the crop circles knew their future or know their future? She writes.
Okay, do I think that the creators of the crop circles know the future?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Probably as with a wider perspective than us. They're like the eagles, and we're still bunnies. We're still in the field, and they're above the field. So I don't think they know the whole future. I don't think they know everything. I don't believe that bubble, 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 bubble. How far out can you go? How far out can we even perceive the universe?
Look at
We're not to the edge of the limits of the universe.
Right? What happens if you're putting a flashlight above you? You're only going to see how many feet around you in that diameter? You're not going to see further than that. It's like shining a spot on a map.
But still, taking a spotlight as opposed to a flashlight, you're going to see more. So yes, they're seeing the future, but they're only seeing aspects of the future. And we really didn't get into future lives, but
I'm going to have to bring you back, because we didn't even touch our scraps on the crystal skulls, and I really wanted to get into that too. There's so much which is so awesome. Anyway, I couldn't think of a better way to leave tonight. Let's talk about where people can find you.
Okay, well, the first place probably is my website, which is it's very easy. It's the 8 letters of my name, CHETSNOW.com. There's a www ahead and all of that stuff. It's not secure. It's nothing special, blah, blah, blah. But if you go there, you'll find out more about what I'm doing. We sponsor Barbara Marciniak. We do sell a crop circle calendar. We do work with Steve Alexander and the crop circle yearbooks. We used to do tours. We don't do that anymore, but we do nevertheless keep in contact with people. So through ChetSnow.com, you can reach me.
Well said. And if you were to leave one piece of final information that I was going to stop broadcasting, what would your final word be to everybody?
I'm not quite sure I understand. What the final thing?
The final thought you want to leave this show to the listeners.
Okay, the 2 things. One is nothing is exactly as it seems to be, and 2, we can co-create the reality that we want to be in if we take the trouble to do it.
Well said. And that is going to be the point I'm going to leave it.